My apartment smells of old books and brewed tea, a scent I've carefully curated over decades. It's the fragrance of a life lived, of knowledge collected, of quiet mornings spent reading before the world stirs. Visitors sometimes joke that I'm like a library that came to life. Neat on the outside, full of unexpected treasures on the inside. My name is Abbott Knightley. I am 68 years old, and I taught history at Bloomington University for nearly 40 years. 3 years ago, I retired, not entirely by choice, but under gentle insistence from the administration, eager to make way for younger voices. I suspect my stubborn dedication to classical teaching methods and my sharp criticism of digital shortcuts played no small part in their encouragement. My apartment is modest, 2 rooms in a brick building on Maple Street. Nothing fancy, but comfortable. Enough for me. My living room is lined with bookcases that groan under the weight of history, philosophy, and art, while reproductions of Renaissance paintings soften the walls. Among the pictures, one photograph remains at the center. My late wife Elizabeth with our son Silas. He is 7 there, holding her hand tightly, a gap-toothed grin lighting his face. Elizabeth passed away from cancer when Silas was 9. Leukemia had claimed her in just 3 months, leaving me alone with a boy too young to understand why his mother wouldn't come home. "Daddy, when is Mommy coming back?" he would ask, every night, and I could never find the strength to tell him the truth, that she was gone, forever. That night, that silence, carved the first deep distance between us. I buried myself in work trying to be strong for Silas while hiring a parade of nannies who came and went with depressing regularity. By the window stands a worn leather armchair, a gift from my colleagues for my 60th birthday. I spend most of my days there, reading, thinking, sometimes making notes in a small notebook, a habit from my teaching days. My thoughts are structured as always, an introduction, a main part, and a conclusion. Even without an audience, the pattern comforts me. Today the light is gray, muted by the overcast sky, and I don't turn on any lamps. Electricity is precious, and why illuminate a room where only silence waits? Yesterday, an email arrived from Silas, the kind he prefers to sending calls, as if written words protect him from confrontation or disappointment. I reread it 3 times, absorbing every line. Dad, Pearl, and I are hosting a dinner for her co-workers next Saturday. It would be great if you could help with the arrangements. You're good with wine and serving, aren't you? Right, if you can be here by 5. Even in writing, he sounded distant. Father, not Dad. That cold formality had become the norm ever since he married Pearl Brockhurst. The invitation didn't include joining them for dinner. Only a request to help, with preparations. I nodded quietly to myself. I've long accepted this was the reality. Pearl came from a family of jewelers, the Brockhursts, whose stores are the definition of Midwest luxury. She is the eldest daughter, poised, sharp, and always calculating. When Silas first brought her to meet me, I noticed how her eyes swept my apartment, lingering on the well-worn book spines, the faded curtains as if appraising their worth. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I finally meet the legendary Professor Knightley, she said, her tone polite but measured, almost testing me. Silas had told her little about me. Otherwise, she might have known I prefer to be called Abbott, and that titles are merely functional. She didn't pause to adjust. I simply shook her hand, aware from the start that I was not meeting a person. I was meeting a strategy, a performance wrapped in charm. Silas met Pearl at a technology conference. She dazzled with confidence and knowledge, winning him with her polish and assurance. In a way, I understood him. She bears a resemblance to Elizabeth, my Elizabeth. But where my wife radiated warmth, Pearl scrutinizes, calculating, always measuring. Their wedding was lavish, funded entirely by her parents, with me seated at a distant table beside strangers whose names I would never recall. Alda Brockhurst had introduced me dryly. "This is Silas's father. He taught history. The word taught carried the weight of mediocrity, of work without glamour. After the wedding, Silas's calls dwindled, from once a week to once a month to rare emails only. Their marriage, while outwardly perfect, transformed him, molding him into a man whose laughs sounded forced, whose smiles felt rehearsed, as if living within a performance designed for Pearl's family's approval. The first request for help came a year ago, soft and ingratiating from Pearl's voice. Abbott, Silas tells me you know a great deal about art and antiques. We're hosting a small reception for my father's partners. Would you help with the theme and describe some of the items in the collection? Flattered, I agreed. When I arrived, Pearl moved with efficiency and precision, directing me with sharp instructions. Please don't touch without gloves. Keep explanations brief. Guests lose interest quickly. She ushered me through the house, pointing out objects, assigning tasks. That night, I realized my role had shifted. I was not father, not family, but a living prop, an expert in the room, serving their needs, impressing their guests. Silas stood nearby, nervous, his own presence diminished in the shadow of his wife's assertiveness. Over time, my role expanded. My knowledge of wine menus and formal etiquette became part of the function Pearl expected. You have a natural taste, Silas would comment, a mix of pride and surprise, as though rediscovering the father he had almost forgotten existed. Pearl remained practical, always demanding, always directing. When the evening ended, she never offered me hospitality. Rooms were available, dinners could be shared, but my presence was merely utilitarian, rented and then returned. Silas noticed occasionally. He would awkwardly tap my shoulder, murmur, "Thanks for helping. Pearl appreciates it." We both understood the truth. He meant little of it, and neither of us could voice the discomfort. Over time, Silas began to adopt Pearl's mannerisms, her focus on appearance and social status. Suits, watches, discussions of stocks and golf replaced our shared history, our quiet conversations about books and art. Once I suggested an exhibition of medieval manuscripts. "Why, father? They're just old books," he said, confused, almost disdainful. In that moment, I realized how far he had drifted, not just physically, but spiritually, from the son I had raised, from the boy who once held his mother's hand and smiled at the world with wonder. I felt especially keenly how far apart we were. My son, who had once listened with rapt attention to my stories about historical battles and ancient civilizations, now considered it all useless knowledge. Irrelevant to real life, that is, to making money and maintaining a certain status. And yet I continued to answer his letters and come at his beck and call, perhaps out of weakness of character or out of fear of finally losing touch with the only close person I had left. Or maybe it was simply because I had nothing else to do. Sad to admit, but helping to organize these appointments was the highlight of my monotonous retirement life. I look at the letter on my computer screen and realize that, of course, I will agree. I will write a polite reply, wear my only decent suit on Saturday, arrive on time, and do whatever Pearl asks. I'll smile at her co-workers, tell them about the wines by the glass and historical anecdotes relevant to the evening's theme. And when it's over, I'll go back to my quiet apartment, to my books and memories, which grow fuzzier and more colorless with each passing year. But sometimes in rare moments of honesty with myself, I admit that there's a deafening irritation growing inside me, not towards Silas. His choices I can understand. He just wants to be happy. And if that requires conforming to the expectations of his wife and her family, then why not? My irritation is directed at Pearl and her parents, at their superficiality disguised as sophistication, at their condescension passed off as hospitality, and also at myself for letting them treat me like a handy tool to be used and put away in the closet until next time. for not having the courage to be honest with my son, for knowing a secret that could destroy the Brocklehurst family's impeccable facade, but keeping it to myself for fear of repercussions. I close my laptop and walk over to the window. A fine rain drizzles outside, people hurrying about their business, umbrellas and hoods covering themselves. Just an ordinary day in Bloomington, the city where I've lived most of my life, but never really felt at home. Maybe it's because home isn't walls and a roof. It's the people you feel connected to. And my only connection was growing thinner by the day, threatening to break off altogether. The phone rang on Wednesday around 4 in the afternoon. I was just making tea pondering an article on the impact of the Mongol invasion on the culture of Russia, a subject I had become fascinated with in retirement. When I saw my son's name on the screen, I tensed involuntarily. Silas usually wrote emails, rarely called, and almost always those calls meant some kind of request or problem. Dad, are you home?" Silas's voice sounded nervous with that peculiar intonation he had when it came to Pearl or her parents. "Yes, Silas." "Did something happen?" "Not exactly. It's just Rupert and Alda are coming over on Saturday. All of a sudden, no warning. Pearl just found out. They're staying with us for a couple of days on their way to Chicago." I felt something inside me clench. Pearl's parents' visits were always an event that threw Silas off balance. Even though they'd been married for 5 years, he was still trying to impress the Brocklehursts, as if he was still afraid they'd find him unworthy of their precious daughter. "And you need my help." It wasn't a question. Yes. "If you don't mind. Pearl wants to have a special dinner to take their minds off some issues." I knew exactly what the issues were. Rupert Brockhurst had hinted more and more in recent months that it was time for Silas to integrate fully into the family business, to leave these computer toys behind. Pearl supported her father, believing that being vice president at Brocklehurst and Sons was more prestigious than being a top programmer at a technology company, even a successful one. "Do you want me to help organize the dinner?" "That's okay." "You know you're better at it." Pearl's in a panic. She wanted to cater, but Lestro is booked up 2 weeks in advance. Lebro is the most expensive restaurant in Bloomington, the Brockles' favorite. Of course, Pearl wanted to order food from there. Nothing else would meet her standards. I could cook it myself, I afraid, knowing that was what Silas was counting on. Something classic, French or Italian. Pearl was thinking French, something sophisticated but not too complicated. And wine. You know about wine, don't you? There was such hope in his voice that I couldn't say no. Despite all our difficulties, this is my son, and he's asking for help. "All right, Silas. I'll come. Back tomorrow, see what's available, and make a shopping list. Tell Pearl not to worry. Thank you, Father." The relief in his voice was almost palpable. "You don't know how important this is. Wirt has recently hinted that he wants to discuss my future in the company. This dinner should go perfectly." After the conversation, I remained seated in the chair, looking at the cooling tea. It was the same again. Silas's eagerness topples his, wife's family, as if his own personality, his desires, and his plans meant nothing. My son once dreamed of starting his own technology company. Know he's willing to give up what he loves for a place in his father-in-law's business, which he will get only by right of descent, not because of his talents or merit. I was reminded of another Silas, a 15-year-old who spent hours with a computer, taking it apart and putting it back together, creating his first programs. He was so enthusiastic, so full of enthusiasm. "Dad, I want to change the world with technology," he used to say. Then, where had that boy with the burning eyes gone? In the morning, I gathered the necessary things: a set of special knives, a gift from my colleagues for my 50th birthday, some rare spices from my collection, and a shabby notebook with recipes I had collected all my life. Many of them were inherited from Elizabeth. She was a great cook. As I was packing, I thought about how strange life was. Here I was, a historian by training and vocation, going to cook a gourmet dinner for people who saw me as nothing more than a living supplement to their lavish lifestyle. On the way to my son's house, I couldn't help but think about Pearland, what I know about her. It was 3 years ago, shortly after I retired. I was working on an article about the evolution of educational systems and was looking for information about elite private schools, one of which Pearl had graduated from. In the course of my search, I came across an archived version of a high-end escort website. The site had long been defunct, but archival copies survived in databases accessible through the university library. And there, among the dozens of profiles of escort ladies, I saw her. The photo was taken about 10 years ago, but I couldn't be mistaken. The same blonde hair, the same slightly haughty curve of her lips. In her profile, she called herself Amethyst and offered intellectual and aesthetic accompaniment for gentlemen with refined taste, specializing in high events, business dinners, cultural events. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake or coincidence, but then I found a few more mentions of Amethyst on forums and in escort reviews. Some clients praised her education inability to keep a conversation going on any topic, while others noted her willingness to be private for an additional fee. When I matched the dates, I realized that Pearl had been doing it while she was at university, and for several years after that, until she met Silas. It took me a while to realize this information. I didn't feel morally condemned. Life was too complicated to make a blanket judgment. Maybe she was in serious financial trouble. Maybe she didn't want to depend on her parents. Or maybe she just thought it was an easier way to make a living than the usual student part-time job. In the end, it was her decision and her life. But what really struck me was the blatant hypocrisy. Pearl, who was now playing the role of the impeccable society lady from an old family. Pearl, who wrinkled her nose at the mention of anything vulgar or low. Pearl, whose parents were proud that their daughter was always a paragon of propriety and never stooped to work beneath her dignity. I saved the materials I found, took screenshots, wrote down references, even printed out a few pages and hid them in a safe place. Not for blackmail, no, more out of a researcher's instinct, used to documenting his findings. And I confess, out of some vague premonition that this information might come in handy someday. There were a few times I came close to telling Silas, especially when I saw how Pearl manipulated him, how she made him feel ashamed of his origins and give up on his own dreams. But every time, something stopped me. Fear of permanently destroying our relationship with our son, a reluctance to hurt him, or just the realization that he probably wouldn't believe me, thinking I was trying to destroy his marriage out of jealousy or resentment. And now I was on my way to their house to help throw the perfect dinner for the parents of a woman who was cheating everyone around her. The absurdity of the situation didn't escape my attention. The cab pulled up outside a two-story colonial-style mansion. Silas had bought it 3 years ago, shortly before I retired, at the insistence of Pearl, of course, who thought his previous apartment was not representative enough. The house was surrounded by a manicured lawn with ornamental shrubs trimmed. In geometric shapes, it looked immaculate and impersonal, like an illustration from a real estate magazine. Pearl opened the door without even letting me ring the bell. Apparently, she was watching the driveway. "Abbott, I'm so glad you're here." Her smile seemed almost genuine. "We're a total disaster with this dinner. I wanted to order from Listro, but it's full, and the other restaurants in town are terrible." She took me by the arm and led me into the house, still speaking with that special tone she used when she needed something, a mixture of flattery and slight desperation. "Silas said you were an amazing cook. I remember that quiche you made for our spring reception." All the guests loved it. Inside, the house looked even more sterile than the outside. Impeccably white walls, minimalist furniture, a few abstract paintings and thin frames. Not a single photograph, not a single personal item in sight. It was like a furniture store showroom, not a residential home. Silas was waiting in the kitchen, tapping his fingers nervously on the marble countertop. When he saw me, he visibly relaxed. "Father, thank you for coming. We're in a mess. Pearl wanted to make a soul, but it fell off twice. Don't worry, we'll fix it. I set my bag on the table and started taking out knives and spices. Silas, any ideas for the menu? Something French, but not too pretentious, Pearl interjected. Rupert doesn't like experimental cuisine. And a meat dish for the second course. He doesn't think a dinner without meat is a dinner without meat. I nodded mentally, going over the recipes. How about a classic French menu? Let's start with onion soup with croutons and gruyere, then duck breast with cherry sauce and potato gratin. For dessert, creme brulee with lavender. Pearl glowed. That sounds perfect. Rupert loves duck, and creme brulee is Alda's favorite dessert. Then we need to make a shopping list and start preparing. Some components take time. We spent the next few hours planning dinner down to the smallest detail. I made a detailed grocery list, and Silas went shopping at a specialty store on the other side of town. Pearl set the table, and I began to prepare the broth for the soup. It was better to make it ahead of time so the flavor would be more intense. As I watched Pearl carefully arranging the china plates and silverware, I couldn't help but think of the duality of her nature. On the one hand, this impeccable socialite for whom the right glasses and perfectly ironed napkins are important. On the other is the girl who once sold her society to wealthy men. Which of these is the real Pearl? Perhaps both versions are equally real. We all play different roles depending on the circumstances. You're placing the red wine glasses too close to the plate, I remarked when she had finished with one of the place settings. Better a little to the right in line with the meat knife. Pearl threw me a quick glance, a mixture of annoyance and appreciation. Of course, you're right. I'm always confused about these subtleties. It comes with experience, I replied neutrally. When you've been organizing faculty receptions for decades, you have to memorize the rules of etiquette. She smiled, but there was something like suspicion in her eyes. Sometimes I think, Abbott, that you know more about me than you're letting on. We stared into each other's eyes for a moment, and I almost dared to say, yes, Pearl, I know things about you that would shatter this carefully constructed facade, but instead I just shrugged. I'm a historian. Observation and analysis are my profession. She turned away first, going back to setting the table. We worked in silence, each absorbed in our own thoughts. When Silas returned with the grocery bags, the atmosphere lightened a little. He looked more relaxed than he had in the morning. The shopping had always had a calming effect on him, something he'd had since childhood. I found everything, Father, even the lavender for the dessert. He started putting the groceries on the table, and I bought that red wine you recommended. Good. I looked around. Now we need to marinate the duck. Silas, can you help me with that? Together we prepared a marinade of orange juice, honey, rosemary, and garlic. Working side by side with my son, I felt a shadow of the closeness I'd felt before. Pearl came along. We used to cook together a lot, and especially on weekends, Silas liked to experiment with spices, creating unusual combinations. Now he just followed my instructions mechanically as if he were afraid to take the initiative. Do you remember when we made curry with 3 kinds of peppers? I asked, chopping garlic. Vaguely, he answered, but there was a spark of recognition in his eyes. I think I added too much cardamom then. Yes, and the dish was almost inedible, but you ate the rest of it anyway, claiming it was the way it was supposed to be. We both smiled at that memory. For a moment, Silas was the same old Silas, my son, not an extension of the Brocklehurst family. I miss those times, he said quietly, looking down at his hands. Life was simpler. Not simpler. Different, I corrected. Him. Every period of life has its difficulties and its joys. He was about to say something, but Pearl came back into the kitchen. She took a critical look at our preparations. Everything going according to plan? My parents are coming tomorrow at 6 Tao, so dinner should be at 7 Tao. And Abbott, I was wondering if you could not only cook, but also serve dinner. Our housekeeper has taken the night off, and it's not practical to hire a waiter for one night. Of course, I answered, feeling the familiar bitterness returning. I'm at your service. Pearl, my father isn't a caterer, Silas said, suddenly firm. He's agreed to help with the cooking, but we'll serve the food ourselves. Pearl raised her eyebrows in surprise. I was just thinking, never mind, of course we'll serve it ourselves. She quickly changed the subject to a discussion of what kind of flowers to put on the table, but I could see the irritation in her eyes. This little episode of resistance on Silas's part was an unpleasant surprise. By evening, the basic preparations were complete. The duck was marinating, the broth for the soup was ready, and the ingredients for the dessert were measured and set aside. I explained to Pearl that I would be there by 3 tomorrow to finish the preparations. Why don't you stay for dinner, Abbott? She suggested with a polite smile that didn't affect her eyes. It's getting late. No, thank you. I still have things to do at home. I lied. I didn't have anything to do, but the prospect of spending the evening watching the fake idol of their family life seemed unbearable. Silas hailed me a cab and walked me to the door. Thanks, Dad. We couldn't have done it without you. You're welcome. I buttoned my coat. Silas, are you happy? The question came out of my mouth unprepared. My son blinked in surprise. What? Of course, I'm happy. I have a good job, a beautiful home, a loving wife. I'm not talking about external attributes. You yourself inside. Are you happy with your life? Your decisions? He looked away. Life is complicated, Father. You don't always get exactly what you dreamed of when you were young. But I'm happy with what I have. I really am. I didn't pursue the subject, just nodded and patted him on the shoulder. The important thing is that you're happy. Everything else is secondary. On the way home, I pondered the fine line between lying and self-deception. Does Silas truly believe he's happy with his life? Or has he just convinced himself that he's because the alternative is too painful? And myself, do I really keep Pearl's secret out of noble motives? Or am I just afraid of losing my son for good? The cab pulled up outside my house. After paying the driver, I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, staring out the dark windows of my apartment. Tomorrow was a big day, a day that could change everything or leave everything the same if I stayed. Silent again. The decision hadn't been made yet, and that made me feel anxious and light at the same time, like I was about to leap into the unknown. Saturday was overcast with low clouds that promised rain by evening. I arrived at Silas's house at 3 sharp. As promised, Pearl opened the door, impeccably dressed and coiffed, as if her parents had already arrived, even though their visit was still 3 hours away. Abbott, come in quickly. We had a little problem with the dessert, she said quickly, nervously, fixing a loose strand of hair. I tried to start preparing it myself, but something went wrong. Silas was in the kitchen, staring at a bowl of something that looked like it was supposed to be creme brulee, but had turned into a lumpy, unappetizing mass. Sonam, I told you to wait for your father, he said, with a slight rebuke in his voice. Desserts aren't our strong suit, it's okay, I reassured them as I took off my coat. We have plenty of time to fix this. The next 2 hours passed in intensive work. I recooked the cream for the dessert while I worked on the duck breast and the sauce. Pearl grew more and more nervous as the hour of my parents' arrival approached, meticulously checking every detail of the table setting and changing the floral arrangement in the center of the table several times. They're always so critical, she complained, arranging the candles, especially Mom. Nothing escapes her gaze. I didn't say anything, though. I was tempted to point out that the apple didn't fall far from the tree. Pearl had inherited from her mother not only her exquisite looks, but her habit of judging everything and everyone by a certain standard. At 5:30, Silas went upstairs to change, and I stayed in the kitchen, finishing the sauce for the duck. Pearl suddenly sat down on a high stool by the kitchen island, watching me. Unusually quiet, she seemed absorbed in her own thoughts. You know, Abbott, she said at last, sometimes I envy your calmness. You never fuss, never get nervous. It's as if you didn't care what other people thought. Age gives you a certain freedom from other people's opinions, I replied, stirring the sauce. When you live long enough, you realize that most of the things we worry about are really quite insignificant. My parents will never understand that, she sighed. For them, external perception is everything. Reputation, status, connections. For Amament, her socialite mask slipped away, and I was just a tired young woman, tired of conforming to other people's expectations. I almost felt sympathy for her and for you, Pearl. Is that all, too? She met my gaze, and something flashed in her eyes. Maybe sincerity. I don't know who I am without it, she admitted quietly. For too long, I've built my life around a certain image. Before I could answer, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. Pearl was instantly transformed. Her back straight, her chin lifted, her eyes cold and assessing again. "They're here," she said in a different tone of voice. "I'll meet them. Go on with dinner. It must be ready by 7. Rertend Alda Brocklehurst entered the house with that peculiar confidence of people who are used to having the world adjusted to them, not the other way around. Rupert, a tall, trim man in his 60s with a perfectly trimmed gray beard, looked like a successful businessman from an advertising poster. Expensive suit, Swiss watch, well-groomed hands with a massive gold ring. Emelda, a petite blonde with traces of her former beauty, was dressed in an elegant pastel-colored suit, complete with a pearl necklace that must have cost as much as, say, a professor's annual pension. From the kitchen, I could hear their greetings loud with exaggerated joy, as if they hadn't seen each other in years, not a month. Silas came downstairs perfectly coiffed and wearing the same blue jacket Pearl had picked out for him last Christmas, claiming it made him look more personable. "Son," Rupert's voice rumbled through the house. "How's business? Have you made up your mind about my offer?" "Not now, darling," Alda intervened. "First, we need something refreshing to drink. It was so stuffy on the road." They moved into the living room, and I could no longer hear the words, only the general hum of voices. As I continued my work in the kitchen, I thought about how important it was for some people to maintain a certain lifestyle and social status. The Brockle belonged to this type. For them, form is always more important than substance, external perception more valuable than inner essence. In this sense, they were the exact opposite of what I had been teaching students all these years. To look for depth, to analyze context, to see behind the facade, the true essence of things. At 7, everything was ready. Onion soup with crispy croutons waited in elegant Bon cups, duck breast, perfectly cooked, rested under foil, and creme brulee was solidifying in the refrigerator. I changed out of my work clothes for the clean white shirt I had thoughtfully brought with me and entered the living room to announce that dinner was ready. The family was seated around the coffee table with glasses of champagne. Pearl sat on the edge of the couch next to her mother, Silas, in the chair across from his father-in-law. All 4 of them turned to me as I entered. "Ah, there's our chef," Rupert exclaimed, with that peculiar condescension that rich people often show to their staff. "Pearl says you've prepared something special for us." "Just a classic French menu," I replied discreetly. "Dinner is served if you're ready. Lead the way, maestro." Rupert rose gallantly, offering his hand to his wife. "Emelda loves French food. We were in Provence last month, staying in a charming chateau. While everyone was seated at the table, I brought the soup and began to pour it into bowls. Alda looked at the table setting. "Pearl, my dear, are you using your grandmother's silverware? Isn't that too much honor for an ordinary family dinner?" "I wanted to create a special atmosphere, Mother," Pearl replied with a slight strain in her voice. "Besides, silver loses its luster if you don't use it." "Reasonable?" Alda nodded, though it was clear from her tone that she disapproved of such wastefulness. The soup was met with compliments, though Robert remarked that his favorite restaurant in Lyons served something similar, but with a special charm that is certainly lacking here. I silently took the empty cups and returned to the kitchen for the main course. The conversation at the table revolved around business, social news, and future plans. Rupert talked a lot about the expansion of the store chain, the new antique-inspired jewelry collection, and the importance of keeping his finger on the pulse of the industry. Silas mostly nodded and nodded along, occasionally inserting brief comments. Pearl played the role of attentive daughter and caring hostess, pouring wine and steering the conversation in the right direction. When I served the duck breast, the conversation suddenly turned to the subject of education. Higher education is completely devalued now, Rupert said as he cut the meat. All these universities are churning out degrees like a conveyor belt. What's the use? I know dozens of successful people with no formal education, but Pearl had a master's degree, Silas countered. And it helped her career. That's different, Rupert said. Pearl had gone to a prestigious university that valued practical skills and connections over rote learning. Besides, she always knew what she wanted to achieve. Alda looked at her daughter with pride. Our Pearl has always been a goal-oriented person, never a trifler, always choosing the right environment. I grinned involuntarily, remembering the dignified entourage on the escort website. Pearl, noticing my reaction, gave me a weary look. "Something wrong with the duck, Abbott?" she asked with feigned concern. "Nothing's wrong," I replied. "I just remembered a story about a prestigious education and its unexpected uses." "Oh, tell me," Rort perked up. "I love a good story at dinner." Pearl quickly intervened. "I'm afraid Abbott's stories are too academic for casual conversation." "Dad, didn't you tell me how the meeting with the Japanese investors went?" Rupert, however, did not let himself be led astray. No, I'm interested. What's the story, Abbott? You were a professor, if I remember correctly, weren't you?" "Yes, a history professor," I confirmed, ignoring Pearl's warning glance. "A rather curious story, though." "Not my own. A colleague of mine discovered that some female students from very wealthy families were moonlighting as escorts in order to maintain a certain standard of living during their studies. Not technically breaking the law, of course, just escorting wealthy gentlemen to various events. There was silence at the table. Alda looked shocked. Rupert frowned. Silas looked at me and his wife in confusion. Pearl froze, clutching her fork so tightly her knuckles turned white. "What an unpleasant subject for dinner," said Alda at last. "Pearl, my dear, does your father-in-law always tell such stories at the table?" "I apologize," I mimed contrition. "I was engrossed in an academic interest, professional deformity." "I understand," Rupert nodded indulgently. "When you're dealing only with books and theories, it's easy to lose touch with real-life indecency." That comment struck a nerve with me. All my life I've taught students to see the connection between past and present, between theory and practice. And this self-righteous trinket salesman dares to talk about real life. "That's an interesting point," I said, trying to remain calm, especially considering that it is theoretical research and historical analysis that allows us to understand the cyclical nature of economic processes. For example, the current trend for ethically produced jewelry has its roots in the anti-colonial movement of the 60s. Rurt looked puzzled, clearly not expecting such a detailed answer from the service staff. Pearl was quick to change the subject. Silas just finished an important project for his company. "Tell your parents, dear." Dinner continued, but the tension was still there. I served and cleared the plates, occasionally inserting a comment when the conversation turned to topics I knew something about. Each time, Pearl or Alda would hurriedly divert the conversation, as if afraid I'd bring up something unseemly again. When it was time for dessert, I brought the crème brûlée, already decorated with a caramelized crust and a sprig of mint. Rupert was on his third glass of wine by this point and visibly relaxed. "I have to admit, Silas," he said, tapping the caramelized crust with his spoon, "your father is an excellent cook. Maybe we should get him a full-time job," he said, laughing at his own joke. He laughed at his own joke. A good cook is worth his weight in gold these days. Abbott only helps us occasionally, Pearl answered in his place. He has his own life, his own occupations. There was an undercurrent of disdain in her voice, and that was the last straw. All these years I tolerated the condescension, silently endured the insinuations of my uselessness and detachment from reality. But now, looking at this smug company discussing me as if I wasn't standing next to them, I felt something inside me break. Actually, I'm doing research on the influence of Victorian morality on modern society, I said, drawing everyone's attention. I'm particularly interested in the phenomenon of double standards and social masks, the way people create a certain image for the public, hiding their true nature. Imelda pressed her lips together. It's a rather esoteric topic. I don't see how it could be of any practical use. On the contrary, it's very practical, I argued. For example, it helps you recognize when people aren't who they say they are, when the facade of respectability hides something else. I noticed Pearl tense, her fingers clutching the napkin. Silas looked at me with a slight perplexity, not sure where I was going with this. Social conventions are necessary for society to function, Rupert said arrogantly. Without them, there would be chaos. I agree, I nodded. But there's a difference between conformity and outright hypocrisy, between creating an image and completely falsifying one's identity. The atmosphere at the table thickened. Pearl fidgeted restlessly in her chair, obviously trying to figure out how to get the conversation moving in a safe direction. Why don't we talk about something more pleasant? She suggested with a strange smile. Like your trip to Provence. Mom, did you say the castle was amazing? Yes, dear. Imelda picked up on that. The shadow dates from the 18th century, although some elements date from earlier. Abbott, as a historian, you'd probably appreciate. I'm afraid you won't be interested in my assessment, I interrupted. As Rupert pointed out, I am too detached from real life. Perhaps my view of history is also too theoretical. Don't take offense, dear. Imelda tried to smooth things over. Rupert simply meant that practitioners and theorists have different approaches to life. Oh, I know exactly what Rupert meant, I replied, feeling my resolve growing inside me. He thinks that people like me, those who have devoted their lives to education and the pursuit of truth, are less valuable than those who can make money and maintain the appearance of success. Rupert blushed. I never said, but you thought so. I finished for him. And so did your daughter. To Pearl, I'd always been an annoying reminder of Silas's humble origins, that he wasn't from your circle, a handy assistant to the reception, nothing more. Father, please, Silas, interjected, clearly disturbed by the direction of the conversation. Let's not. Why not, Silas? I turned to my son. Why not finally say out loud what everyone's thinking? Your father-in-law and mother-in-law think I'm nothing. Your wife uses me as free labor. And you? You just let it happen. There was a dead silence at the table. Rupert's face was flushed, and Alda looked as if she'd swallowed a lemon whole. Silas was staring at his plate, unable to meet my gaze. Pearl was the only one who looked calm, though I could see her lips turning white. I think Abbott's tired, she said at last in an icy tone. It's been a long day, and we're all a little over-exited. Maybe you should rest. That was the last straw. This condescension, this desire to shut me up, to dismiss me as an annoying child or a senile old man. Don't worry about my condition, Pearl, I said, rising to my full height. I know exactly what I'm doing and saying, and now would be a good time to say one more thing. Abbott, please, she said, a note of panic in her voice for the first time. He's just a servant in this house. Don't mind him, she added quickly, turning to her parents. A servant. That's what I'd been to her all these years. Not her husband's father, not our respected professor, not a man with his own dignity and history, just a servant. I rose slowly from the table, feeling strangely calm, as if everything that was happening had been planned long ago. as if every word had been written in a script that I had only now decided to read. Well, it's time for me to tell. You a secret about your daughter? I said, looking straight into Rert and Alda's eyes. Pearl turned pale, her hands shaking so violently that the wine nearly spilled onto the tablecloth. Don't, she whispered. Please. There was silence at the table. I felt strangely calm, as if I'd finally shrugged off a weight I'd been carrying for years. Rupert and Alda Brocklehurst froze, their gazes darting between me and my daughter. Silas frowned, not knowing what was happening. Only Pearl knew her face was ash-colored, her fingers frantically gripping the edge of the tablecloth. Abbott, I think you'd better leave, Emelda began with feigned calm. You're obviously overworked. No, Emelda, I shook my head. I think you should listen to what I have to say. It concerns your family and the reputation you hold so dear. Rupert straightened, his eyes narrowing. If this is some kind of blackmail attempt, it's nothing of the sort. I remained unfazed. It's just the truth. You have a right to know. The truth about how your daughter really paid for her prestigious education. Pearl stood up abruptly, knocking over her glass. The red wine spilled over the white tablecloth like a blood stain. Don't, her voice shook. Please, Abbott, let's talk in private. We've talked privately for years, Pearl, I replied. Well, we haven't. You pretended I didn't exist or used me when it suited you. You've treated me like a servant. Now, it was time for the truth. I turned to Rort, and Alda, your daughter, of whom you are so proud, has an interesting past. While she was studying at that most prestigious university where practical skills and connections are valued, she worked as an escort model. Simply put, she provided escorts to wealthy men for money. Emelda made a squeeze sound like a sob. Rupert froze with his mouth open. Silas turned slowly toward his wife, his face a look of utter bewilderment. What is this nonsense? Rert finally said. How dare you? It's a lie! Pearl interrupted him, trying desperately to keep her composure. Papa, I'm afraid I have proof, I said calmly, pulling an envelope from my inside jacket pocket. I always carried it with me, waiting for the right moment. Here are printouts from the archives of the VIP Companions website. Did you know that your daughter performed under Thealia's Amethyst? I laid some photos and screenshots on the table. One of them showed Pearl, much younger, but undoubtedly her, in an elegant evening gown with a deep neckline with a glass of champagne in her hand with the same characteristic half-smile she had now. The caption under the photo read, Amethyst is a sophisticated accompaniment for connoisseurs of beauty. Emelda grabbed the photo with trembling hands. This is some kind of mistake, she muttered. Photoshop or Pearl, tell them. Pearl stood frozen like a statue, her gaze fixed on the evidence spread out on the table. Silas gingerly picked up one of the screenshots, a page with rates and a description of Amethyst services. Intellectual and aesthetic escort, $1,000 per evening, special conditions discussed individually. He read aloud, his voice sounding muffled as if from far away. Pearl? The Pearl? What is it? I can explain, she finally said, her voice sounding unnaturally high. It was a long time ago. I was young and foolish. Did you? Did you really do it? Alda looked as if she was about to faint. Our daughter, our Pearl. It was a temporary solution. Pearl's voice grew stronger, more defensive. I needed money for my studies. You said yourself that I had to become independent, that I had to take advantage of every opportunity. We meant internships, part-time jobs in decent places, Rupert exclaimed, his face flushed with anger. Not prostitution. It wasn't prostitution, Pearl snapped at him. I was just escorting men to events. Used my intelligence and education to special conditions to be discussed individually. Silas quoted again, his voice trembling. What does that mean, Pearl? There was a heavy silence in the room. Pearl looked from her parents to her husband, her eyes filling with tears. It was a long time ago, she repeated quietly. I was a different person. No, Rupert slammed his fist on the table so hard that the plates bounced. You're still the same person. You've just gotten better at hiding who you really are. He turned to me, his eyes flashing with lightning. How long have you known this? Why didn't you say anything? I discovered it 3 years ago by accident. I answered honestly. I didn't tell him because I didn't want to destroy my son's family. I hoped Pearlwood would change. Treat him better. Stop manipulating him. And now you're talking because she called you a servant, Rupert said contemptuously. Did it hurt your ego? No, I shook my head. I spoke because I was tired of seeing my son give up himself, his dreams and values to conform to the standards you and your daughter had imposed on him. I spoke up because I couldn't stand your hypocrisy and double standards any longer. Silas was silent the whole time, staring at the photos and screenshots as if trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Finally, he looked up at his wife. Is it true? Is all of this? Is it true? Pearl opened her mouth but couldn't utter a word. Instead, she just nodded, a tear rolling down her cheek. How much? Silas asked quietly. How many men? What difference does it make? Pearl exclaimed suddenly on the offensive. It was before you. I never cheated on you. Never. This isn't about cheating, Silas said quietly. It's about you hiding such an important part of your life from me. You've been lying to me all this time. What was I supposed to say? Pearl almost shouted. Hi, I'm Pearl, and I was an escort model to pay for my education. You wouldn't even look at me after that. You don't know that. Silas shook his head. You didn't give me a chance to decide for myself. Alda had been sitting with her hands over her face the whole time. Now she pulled her hands away and I could see her devastated face, her mascara smeared. How could you, Pearl? Her voice sounded broken. We gave you everything. The best upbringing, the best schools. We've always supported you. You gave me everything except the freedom to be myself, Pearl shouted. All my life I had to conform to your expectations, to be the perfect brothel daughter. Do you know why I started working as an escort model? Because for the first time in my life, I felt I was in control, that I was making my own choices. Rupert looked at his daughter as if he were seeing her for the first time. Everything we did was for your own good, he said bitterly. And you dishonored us. You dishonored our family name. Family name? Pearl grinned bitterly. It's always about the family name, about reputation, about what other people will say. It's never about how I feel, what I want. And what did you want? Silas asked quietly, because it obviously wasn't me. For you, I was just a stepping stone to a normal life, a way to rehabilitate yourself in the eyes of your parents and society. Pearl turned to him, something resembling sincerity in her eyes. No, Silas, I wasn't. Yeah, I really loved you. You were so honest, so real, in a way that I could never be, but you kept lying to me. Silas shook his head. Our whole acquaintance, our whole life together, and made me ashamed of my father, my background, my interests, made me lie to myself. Emelda stood up suddenly, her movements sharp as a marionette. I can't hear it anymore. I can't be here. Rupert, we're leaving. Rupert nodded, rising as well. Yes, we need to think it over. He turned to his daughter, his face a stone mask. Pearl, I need time, a lot of time. Yeah, I don't know if I'll ever be able to look at you the way I used to. Daddy, please. Pearl took a step toward him, holding out her hand. Let me explain. Explain what? Rupert asked coldly. How you've been deceiving us all these years. How you've allowed strange men to... He didn't finish the sentence as if the thought were too painful. We're leaving, he repeated firmly, and I think we'd better not talk for a while. Perhaps for a long time. Mother. Pearl turned to Alda in despair. Say something? Alda only shook her head, her eyes blank. You're not the daughter I knew or thought I did." With those words, she headed for the dining room. Rupert followed her, but stopped at the door and turned to Silas. "I'm sorry you were dragged into this outrage. You seem like a decent man. Too bad you picked the wrong woman." And they left. We heard the front door slam, the engine of their car start, the tires rustle on the gravel of the driveway, and then there was silence. Pearl collapsed into a chair, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Silas stood motionless, staring into the space in front of him. I felt devastated. There was no triumph, no relief, only the bitter realization that some wounds can't be healed by the truth. Sometimes the truth only creates new, deeper wounds. "Why didn't you tell me?" Silas finally spoke, turning to me. There was no anger in his voice, only wariness and frustration. "Why did you keep this secret for 3 years?" "I didn't know how to approach the subject," I answered honestly. "I was afraid of your reaction, afraid you'd choose her side, that I'd lose you completely, and then I just couldn't find the right moment." "The right moment?" Silas grinned bitterly. "And tonight, in the middle of dinner with her parents, seemed like the right time." "No." I shook my head. "It was an impulsive decision. Wrong, maybe. But I couldn't keep quiet any longer. Seeing you change, giving up everything you loved and valued to meet their standards." Pearl lifted her tear-stained face. "You did it out of revenge." Her voice sounded hoarse-sorrow. "Because I called you a servant. Because I didn't respect you the way you thought you deserved." "You're partly right," I admitted. "My decision was personal. But most of all, I wanted to protect my son." "Protect him?" Pearl laughed through her tears. "You ruined his family. You ruined my life." "No, Pearl," I said quietly. "You ruined your own life when you chose to build it on lies. Lies have a way of coming out at the worst possible moment." Silas sank slowly into his chair. His shoulders slumped. "I need to think," he said, looking down at his hands. "About all of this, about us." He looked at Pearl. "About who we are to each other." Pearl reached out, trying to touch him, but Silas pulled away. "Not now," he said softly. "Please." He turned to me, his eyes full of pain. "I think you should leave, Father." "Yeah, I'll call you when I'm ready." I nodded, feeling my heart clench. Despite everything that had happened, despite all my good intentions, I had hurt the own person I wanted to protect. "I understand," I said quietly. "I'm sorry if you can." I gathered my things and left the dining room. Behind me, I heard Silas and Pearl's muffled voices. They were beginning the conversation that would probably be the last of their marriage, or the first honest conversation they'd had in a while. I didn't remember how I'd gotten home. My feet automatically carried me through the familiar streets of Bloomington, while my mind wandered among the wreckage of an evening I turned into ruin by my own hand. The rain, which had started while I'd still left Silas's house, had intensified, but I took my time taking cover. The cold drops dripping down my collar felt like a well-deserved punishment. When I finally climbed the creaky stairs to the 3rd floor and unlocked the door to my apartment, the clock read almost midnight. I took off my drenched coat, threw it on the coat rack, and walked into the living room without turning on the light. The familiar outlines of bookcases, an old armchair, and a desk with a computer were visible in the semi-darkness, lit only by the glow of streetlights coming through the unshaded windows. A familiar world that had suddenly become alien. Or was it I myself who had become a stranger to this world? I sank into the chair without taking off my wet clothes and closed my eyes. The scene from Silas's dining room came into view. The frozen faces of Rurtand Alda Brockhurst, Pearl's pale, horrified face, my son's confused look, a scene I directed without fully realizing how devastating the denim would be. Had I done the right thing? That question throbbed in my temples, giving me no respite. Was it justice or revenge? Defense of my son or a selfish desire to prove my worth? I remembered Pearl's dismissive, "He's just a servant," and the wave of anger that had swept over me in that moment. Yes, there was something personal in what I had done. The resentment that had accumulated over the years, the weariness of constant neglect, the pain of my son's growing estrangement from his wife and her family. But there was something else, too. A sincere desire to protect Silas from manipulation, to open his eyes to the true nature of the woman he'd bonded with. I sighed and stood up to finally remove my wet clothes. After changing into dry clothes, I put on the kettle and turned on the table lamp. The dim light only emphasized the dullness of the surroundings. Books, papers, a lonely cup on the table. The life of a man with only memories and regrets. Once when Silas was a boy, this apartment had been filled with life. After Elizabeth died, we moved here from the big house, which had become too empty and humming without her laughter and footsteps. It was hard at first. We were both homesick, both unsure of how to move on. But gradually, we found our rhythm. Silas went to school nearby, and after school, he often came to my department. He would sit quietly in the corner of the classroom, drawing, or reading while I lectured. Students adored him, gave him sweets, and explained their projects. Maybe it was then that he became interested in technology. One of my graduate students often showed him his laptop and taught him simple programming. In the evenings, we would cook dinner together, and then I would check his homework or read aloud to him. Not only children's books, Silas was early addicted to historical novels, especially love stories about ancient civilizations and great discoveries. He had a lively, inquisitive mind and a real talent for science. His school teachers predicted a brilliant future for him. When he entered the university's information technology department, I was immensely proud. Myson, the first generation in our family with a university degree. Elizabeth would have been happy. She always said Silas had her eyes, but my mind. He's going to be special. "You'll see," she whispered, looking at the sleeping infant. And she was right. The university years became a time of our estrangement, a natural process, I told myself. My son is growing up, looking for his own way, gaining independence. It tried not to impose, gave him room to grow and make mistakes. Maybe too much space. Maybe I should have been more persistent, called more often, taken an interest in his life. When he introduced me to Pearl, I immediately sensed something wrong. She was too perfect, beautiful, educated, from a wealthy family, and too interested. In Silas, who for all his virtues had never been the star of a college party or the object of a woman's attention. His enthusiasm for computers, his shyness, his easygoing personality attracted ascertained type of girl, intelligent, modest, valuing depth over outward glitz. Pearl didn't fit into that category. I tried to gently express my doubts, but Silas was blinded by his crush. "You just don't know her like Edo," he said with that peculiar condescension that young people often show to their elders in matters of the heart. "Pearl is not what she seems. She is deeper, more complex." Oh, how right he was without realizing it. Pearl was indeed not what she seemed, but in every different way. The kettle in the kitchen whistled, pulling me out of the flood of memories. I made tea, a strong bergamot tea, just the way Elizabeth liked it, and returned to my chair. Outside, the window. The rain had intensified, the drops drumming against the glass in an uneven, restless rhythm. The phone in the pocket of my robe suddenly vibrated. I shuddered and slowly pulled it out, already knowing who might be calling at this hour. Silas's name popped up on the screen. I stared at the blinking display, hesitant to answer. What could I say to my son? How could I justify what I'd done without sounding like a vengeful old man or a madman? The phone stopped vibrating. A few seconds. Later, a message came through. "Father, we need to talk immediately. What have you done?" I didn't respond. Instead, I muted the sound and placed the phone on the table with the screen facing down. Not out of cowardice, I needed time to gather my thoughts to figure out how I really felt about what had happened, and how I felt. A strange mixture of satisfaction and guilt. Satisfaction that the truth had finally come out, that Pearl and her parents' hypocrisy had been exposed, and guilt for the pain I'd caused my son for shattering his illusions in such a cruel public way. The phone vibrated again silently, but I could see it shaking on the table. Another message from Silas. I know you're awake. Answer me. Pearl is hysterical. Her parents aren't answering their phones. Do you realize what you've done again? I didn't. Answer. What could I say? I'm sorry, son, but your wife is a liar and a manipulator, and I just wanted to open your eyes. Or yes, what I did was cruel. But you need to know the truth about the woman you married. Either answer would sound like an excuse, and I wasn't sure I wanted to make excuses. I took a sip of tea and covered my eyes. The moment when I'd first discovered the truth about Pearl came to mind. I'd been shocked then, unsure of what to do. My first impulse was to tell Silas immediately, but something stopped me. Maybe fear of hurting him, maybe uncertainty about how he would take the information. I decided to gather more data to make sure it was really Pearl and not someone who looked like her. I did a real investigation. I checked dates, compared biographical details, studied other photos on the site. There was no doubt Amethyst was Pearl Brockhurst, then a student at a prestigious university, moonlighting as an escort model to pay for her expensive habits. I put together a dossier, screenshots, printouts, save photos. Not for blackmail, no, rather out of a historian's professional habit of documenting facts. And I confess out of some vague premonition that this information might come in handy someday. And so it came in handy at the most inopportune moment under the most inopportune circumstances. Used not as a tool of defense, but as a weapon of revenge. The phone vibrated a third time. It was ringing now, but it wasn't from Silas. Pearl's name popped up on the screen. I stared at it, puzzled. Why would she call me after everything that had happened? To threaten me? To beg for silence? To curse me for ruining her life? I didn't answer that call either. A minute later, a message came through. Know you're awake, Abbott. We need to talk. Just you and me, please. Herpley's surprised me. In all the years we'd known each other, Pearl had rarely used the word in conversation with me. Usually her phrases sounded like orders disguised as requests. Abbott, could you help with the serving? Or Abbott, would you be so kind as to tell the guests about this painting? I put the phone away, not answering that message either. Now, at this late hour, after everything that had happened, I wasn't ready to talk to my son or his wife. I needed time to realize what had happened, to understand my own feelings. Memories surfaced again now of Silas's early years after Elizabeth's death. How hard it had been for him to accept her passing, how he had waited for her return without realizing the finality of death. How I tried to replace both his parents for him, often clumsily, often wrong, but always lovingly. I remember when he came down with the flu in 6th grade. High fever, delirium. He called for his mom and I sat next to him holding his hand, changing compresses, never leaving his side. 3 days without sleep in constant fear that his condition would worsen. When the crisis passed and he opened his eyes clear from his fever, the first thing he said was, "Daddy, you look terrible. You need to sleep." Even as a baby, he often worried about me more than I worried about myself. Maybe it was growing up too soon, taking on some of the responsibility that should have been on my shoulders. I always admired his fortitude, his ability to adapt to loss, to move on while keeping the memory of his mother in his heart. When he became a teenager, there was some distance between us, a natural part of growing up, of separating from a parent. But even then, There remained a deep understanding, a connection that didn't require words. I always knew when he was in trouble, even if he didn't talk about it. And he could always sense my moods, my unspoken anxieties. What happened to that connection? When did it start to fade into formal communication? After Hugh went to university, after he met Pearl, or even earlier, and I just hadn't noticed, immersed in my work, my research, my own world of books and theories. The phone vibrated again. This time, the message from Silas was short and curt. If you don't answer, I'll come over. Now, was it a threat or a promise? Made me finally pick up the phone and text back. You don't have to come at this hour and in this weather. We'll talk tomorrow when we're both calmer. The reply came instantly. Calmer? You ruined my family and you think I'll be calmer tomorrow? Father, what has gotten into you? Why today? Why in front of her parents? I took a deep breath and began typing. I regret the timing and the manner, but not the fact of the truth being revealed. You deserve to know who your wife really is. There was a long pause after sending that message. I imagined Silas sitting in his house, probably in the very dining room where the drama had played out, trying to process my words. Next to him, probably Pearl, crying, confused, perhaps still trying to justify herself or deny the obvious. Finally, came the answer. 3 years. You knew it for 3 years and kept quiet. And then suddenly you decided to make the spectacle. Why, Father? Was it just because she called you a servant? The question hit me where it hurt the most. Yes, that phrase was the final straw. But was it only that? Hadn't there been years of bitterness over the way Pearl and her parents had treated me? Wasn't there the pain of Silas slowly drifting away, becoming a pale shadow of himself, an appendage of the Brocklehurst family? That's not the only reason, I wrote. I have seen you change under their influence. How you give up your dreams, your essence, how you become what they want you to be, not what you really are. There was no answer for a long time. I stared at the screen, wondering what was happening on the other end of this digital connection. Had my words hurt him, made him think, or only reinforced the belief that his father was a mean, vindictive old man determined to destroy his happiness out of jealousy or resentment? Finally, the phone vibrated again. You had no right to decide for me. You had no right to choose the moment or the way. This is my marriage, my life, and now it's ruined. My son's words cut painfully into my heart. He's right, of course. I acted, impulsively, without thinking of the consequences, without caring about his feelings. Was I really protecting him? Or was I using him as an excuse for my own revenge? I'm sorry, I wrote after a pause. I really didn't think about the consequences, but sooner or later the truth would have come out anyway. Secrets like that don't stay buried forever. It should have been my choice, came the reply. I need time to figure things out. Don't call me, don't write. I'll contact you myself when I'm ready. The last message sounded like a sentence. Silas was drifting away from, not gradually like he had before, but abruptly, definitively. And I was to blame for that. I put the phone away and leaned back in my chair, feeling dead tired. Outside the window, the rain had turned into a downpour, the drops pounding the glass with a fury that reflected the storm in my soul. Was I right to reveal Pearl's secret? In theory, yes. Silas deserved to know the truth about the woman he'd tied his life to. But the way I chose to do it, public humiliation, scandal, destroying a family in front of everyone, was there no malice in it? A desire not just to open my son's eyes, but to punish Pearl and her parents for years of neglect? I remembered Pearl's face as I uttered the fatal words. Horror, shame, despair, but also something else. Relief, like a part of her wanted the truth to come out, two in this endless game of perfect. And Silas's face. Shock, disbelief, pain, and betrayal, not from his wife, but from his father, who'd known the truth for years and had chosen the most devastating way to reveal it. The phone vibrated again. A message from Pearl Abbott. I know you're angry with me. And you have a right to be, but this is not Silas's fault. Don't punish him for my mistakes. Talk to him. It was strange to receive such a message from a woman I just publicly humiliated, whose life I'd possibly ruined. There was a concern for Silas in her words that I'd previously thought was feigned. Maybe I was wrong. Was there a woman who truly loved my son behind the facade of a calculating socialite? Or was it another manipulation, an attempt to turn me against myself, to make me doubt the rightness of my action? I did not respond to this message either. Bridges had been burned, and no words could repair what had been destroyed tonight. Weeks passed in a long silence. Silas didn't call, didn't text. I tried to contact him a few times, but each time I'd stopped myself, remembering his request for time. Or was that in order? The boundary between request and demand was erased in my perception, like so many other boundaries in my relationship with my son. Life went on in a strange, slow rhythm. I got up in the morning, made coffee, read. Sometimes went for a walk, talked to former coworkers on the phone, the usual actions of an ordinary retiree. But there was an emptiness inside, a sucking feeling of incompleteness, like I was stuck between chapters of my own life, unable to turn the page. The weather in Bloomington at the end of April was changeable, from bright sunshine and almost summer-like warmth to a sharp chill with rain and wind. On one of these erratic days, I went downtown for groceries and new glasses. The old ones were hopelessly scratched, and reading was a real challenge. The optician was located on Main Street, not far from the university campus. After the young optometrist, so young it seemed he should be sitting at a desk, not writing prescriptions, checked my vision and fitted me with new lenses, I decided to go to the cafe across the street. A simple desire to sit amongst people, to listen to other people's conversations, to feel part of life, and not just an observer. Byron's Coffee House was a popular place among students and faculty. A small place with bookshelves along the walls, shabby leather couches, and the smell of freshly ground coffee. I used to come here often during my teaching years, checking students' papers or just reading in a quiet corner, enjoying the atmosphere of an intellectual haven. After ordering a cup of black coffee, I sat at a table by the window, looking at the street where people were hurrying about their business. Students with backpacks, office workers in strict suits, young mothers with strollers. Life went on regardless of my personal dramas. And then I saw him. Silas was walking on the opposite side of the street, hands in his jacket pockets, looking down at his feet. He looked gaunt, as if he'd lost weight in the weeks. Even his gait had changed from the confident stride of a successful young professional to the shuffling stride of a man carrying a heavy load. I froze, not knowing what to do. Should I call out, come out to meet him, or to pretend not to notice, to let him pass by, keeping the distance he himself had set? But the decision was made for me. Silas lifted his head and looked straight at the cafe. Our gazes met through the glass, and for a moment there was a range of emotions on his face. Surprise, confusion, something akin to pain, and then determination. He crossed the street and headed for the entrance to the cafe. The bell above the door jingled. Silas walked in, nodded to the barista, and walked slowly to my table. "Father," he said without greeting. "Silas?" I tried to smile, but my lips wouldn't do it. "Would you like to sit down?" He lowered himself into the chair across from me, keeping his jacket on as if he wasn't sure he'd stay long. "How are you?" I asked, unable to find any other words. "How do you think?" There was bitterness in his voice, but not aggression. It was more like the weariness of a man who'd had to grow up a few years at once. "I don't know," I answered honestly. "That's why I'm asking." Silas ran his hand over his face, a gesture I knew from his childhood. It was what he did when he was puzzled by a difficult task or upset about a bad grade. Would you like some coffee? I offered to break the tension. Yeah, I guess so. I called for the waitress and Silas ordered a latte. We sat in silence while his drink was brewing. I looked at my son, noting the changes, the shadows under his eyes, the wrinkle between his eyebrows that hadn't been there before, the slouching shoulders. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in a long time and had been thinking a lot. "You've lost weight?" I remarked as the waitress brought his coffee. "Yeah," he shrugged. "I haven't had time to eat lately." There was silence again. I waited, hesitant to be the first to speak. Silas took a sip of coffee, set the cup down, and finally looked me in the eye. "I'm still mad at you," he said quietly, "for what you did, for choosing the worst possible moment and way, for keeping quiet for 3 years and then suddenly deciding to ruin everything." I nodded, accepting his words without objection, but he continued after a pause. "I understand why you did it, and perhaps in a way you've done me a favor. That admission surprised me." "A favor?" Silas grinned unhappily. "Don't think I'm grateful, but you made me face the truth, not just about Pearl, but about our marriage in general." He took another sip of coffee, collecting his thoughts. "Pearl and we'd been having problems for a long time, even before that night, but I'd turned a blind eye to them, pretended that everything was fine, that we were the perfect couple, that I Washapi as the Brocklehurst son-in-law, that I was ready to be part of their world. And in reality," I asked cautiously. "In reality, I was slowly losing myself," Silas admitted. "My dreams, my principles, my personality. I was becoming what she wanted me to be, successful, presentable, with the right connections and ambition. But that wasn't me, not the real me." He fell silent, looking out the window at the people passing by. After that night, everything changed. Pearl's parents cut off all contact with her completely. Her father blocked her number. Her mother returned all her emails unopened. They even notified her through her lawyer that they were withdrawing her financial support and excluding her from the will. "Harsh," I remarked, though part of me felt grim satisfaction at the news. "Tough, but it's in their spirit." Silas nodded. "They've always been about image and reputation. Pearl's past had jeopardized both." How did Pearl take the breakup with her parents? She was hysterical at first. Called them every day, wrote them letters, tried to meet them. Then something in her broke, or on the contrary, straightened out. She became different, more real. She shed the mask of the perfect daughter from the perfect family. And you know what's weird? I like this new Pearl better. She's, alive. I watched his face carefully, trying to figure out what was going on between him and his wife right now. "So, you're staying together?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. Silas shook his head. "No, our marriage is falling apart, and it's not just the secret that's been revealed. This story just pulled the veil off problems that have been around for a long time. We're different people with different values and different goals. I thought love would overcome those differences, but it only masked them." He paused, looking into his cup as if searching it for answers. "At first, we tried to save the marriage. Pearl suggested we go to a marriage counselor. We went to 3 sessions and each time ended in an argument. She accused me of never truly accepting her, always judging her. I accused her of manipulation and lying. Eventually, we decided we needed a break. I moved into a rental apartment a week ago. I'm sorry," I said, and it was the truth. Despite all my doubts about Pearl, I never wanted my son to suffer. "Did you?" Silas looked at me questioningly. "You never approved of our marriage." "I didn't approve of the way she and her family treated you, the way they changed you. But I wanted you to be happy, Silas. That's all I ever wanted." He stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to determine if I was sincere. Finally, he nodded, accepting my words. You know what the weirdest thing is? He continued after a pause. In a way, I feel better now. It's like a huge weight has been lifted off my shoulders. I don't have to pretend anymore. To conform to other people's expectations. To play a role. I'm being myself again. And who are you now? I asked quietly. Silas hesitated. Honestly, I don't know. I'm 39 and it's like I'm learning to be me all over again. Getting back to work on an old project I'd abandoned because of Pearl and her parents. Remember when I wanted to create a program to teach special needs kids? I nodded. It had been his passion during his university years to develop adaptive technology for children with disabilities. Rupert Brocklehurst thought the idea was charity nonsense with no commercial perspective. I got in touch with a team working on something similar. Silas continued with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen in his eyes in a long time. They're interested in what I've been working on. Maybe it'll work. That's wonderful, I said sincerely. You've always been on fire with this idea. Yes, he smiled weakly. And then he let myself lose sight of it like so many other things. He fell silent, twirling the cup in his hands. Then he looked up and his gaze hardened. But despite all that, despite the fact that in the long run, maybe it's even better this way, I still can't forgive you for what you did. You destroyed my family, Father, and you did it out of revenge. Silas, no, let me finish. He held up his hand, stopping me. I know you had other motives, that you wanted to protect me, to open my eyes, but the way you chose it was a public execution. Father, you humiliated Pearl in front of her parents. You humiliated me by showing that I was blind and stupid. You could have talked to me alone. You could have found another way. But you chose the most painful, most destructive way. And part of me thinks you did it not just for me, but for yourself to avenge all those times you were made to feel inferior, less important. I didn't deny it. There was truth in his words. Bitter, unpleasant, but true. You're right, I said quietly. There was something personal in what I'd done. Revenge, resentment, wounded pride. I'm not making excuses, Silas. I did choose the worst possible way and moment. But, he looked at me questioningly, I can hear the but in your voice. But I'm not sorry the truth came out, I said firmly. I regret the way, my motives, the pain I caused you, but not that you finally learned the truth about Pearl and her family. Silas was silent for a long moment considering my words. Then he nodded as if accepting that answer. You know what's ironic? He said with a bitter chuckle. When I finally talked to Pearl for real, after all the yelling and accusations, she admitted that part of her had always been waiting for the truth to come out, that she was almost relieved when you spoke up, like I could finally stop pretending was what she said. It's hard to live a double life, I remarked, constantly remembering what you said, who you said it to, what version of yourself you showed. Yeah, Silas agreed, and it's not just her. I've been living a double life, too, in a way, pretending that I was happy to be part of the Brocklehurst world, that I liked their values, their lifestyle. Refused to see how I was changing, how I was losing the real me. He was silent for a moment, gathering his thoughts. Pearl told me something else, that a part of her always knew you were guessing about her past, that she saw it in your eyes and the way you looked at her sometimes. And that's why she always kept you at a distance, always tried to belittle you in my eyes, afraid you'd reveal her secret. I never planned on it, I said. Not until that night. It was an impulsive decision. I know. Silas nodded. And that makes it even harder. If you had planned it, it would have been easier to be angry with you, to think of you as a calculating manipulator. But you just snapped because of one phrase. He's just a servant, I repeated Pearl's words quietly, still feeling the sting of pain from that memory. Yeah, Silas grimaced. It was a disgusting phrase. I wish I could say I'd stood up for you right away, but I didn't, and I'm ashamed of that. Those words, that confession, suddenly touched me more than I'd realized. Silas saw his guilt, his part in what was happening. He didn't put the blame on me or Pearl. We all make mistakes, I said. I don't hold it against you, Silas. Sorry. I still do, he said honestly. At you, at Pearl, at myself, but I'm working on it. He finished his coffee and set the cup on the table. You know what the psychologist told me the last time Pearl and I met? That sometimes families are built on sand, on illusions, false expectations, unspoken grievances, and that sooner or later a wave comes along and washes it all away. You can be angry at the wave, but the problem is not the wave, but the foundation. A wise psychologist, I remarked. Yeah, Silas smiled weakly. I wish Pearl and I had listened to him sooner. Maybe we could have built something real, something honest, or maybe we would have realized that we shouldn't be together. He looked at his watch inside. I got to go. I have a meeting with my lawyer in 30 minutes. A lawyer? I asked anxiously. Yes. Pearl and I had decided that a divorce was inevitable. Better to do it in a civilized way without all the drama. There'd been enough of that already. Silas stood up, and I stood up too, not knowing how to say goodbye. Should I hug him? Shake his hand? Just nod? I'll call you the other day, he said, solving the dilemma for me. We had a lot more to talk about, but not right now. Right now, I need to deal with what's left of my marriage. Of course, I nodded, trying to hide my disappointment. Part of me hoped for reconciliation, for a return to the closeness we'd had before Pearl came along, but I knew it was impossible. Too much water had passed. Too many wounds had been inflicted. And Father, Silas added as he headed for the exit. Despite everything, I'm glad I met you today. That we talked. Me too, I replied sincerely. He nodded and walked out of the cafe, the bell above the door jingling as he left. I watched him cross the street and thought about our conversation, about the confessions we'd both made, about the truth that had finally come out between us. He was still angry at me, still blaming me for destroying his family. But in his words, in his gaze, I saw glimmers of understanding, of recognizing my motives, even if he didn't approve of my methods. It was a small step toward reconciliation. Not complete forgiveness, but at least understanding. And that was enough for now. I paid for my coffee and went outside, where the spring wind played with the fallen petals of the blossoming trees. Life went on despite the dramas and tragedies, the broken families and broken hearts. It went on giving a chance for healing, for new beginnings, for righting wrongs. Silas found the strength to admit the truth about his marriage, about himself. Maybe in time, he'd find the strength to forgive me. Not just me, but Pearl and himself. And I will wait and hope that out of the ruins I helped to create, something new and stronger and truer will someday grow.